This session. Thanks for joining. This is our first series, speaker series, fireside side chat series that we are starting with Mission 4.7. I'm Radhika Iyengar at the Center for Sustainable Development and also the chair for Mission 4.7. Mission 4.7 is a group of like-minded organizations that have come together to promote what we call transformative education, which is essentially SDG 4.7. And it's to bring about education, transformative education. We need to understand both the sciences and the social sciences and how they interact with each other. So this series is promoting the interaction and the intersectional analysis between different streams and different areas. And this in mind, I turn over to Haijin Lee from the School of Social Work. She's very passionate about education for sustainable development, so is really the right person to be conducting this interview with our expert today. Just one last word from my side. Thank you for all the organizations that have helped Mission 4.7 to make these monthly series possible. Comparative International Education Society, Environmental and Sustainability Education Special Interest Group, Worldwide Climate and Justice Teach-In, Disaster Preparedness and Resilience Network at the Climate School, and the Global Futures Lab at Arizona State University. Really appreciate all your help, and this will be a monthly series starting with our fantastic discussion today. So over to Haijin for her discussion.
Okay, thank you, Radhika. Pleasure to be with Andrew Kruczkiewicz. We know that you're a wonderful climate scientist with applications for the health and humanitarian sectors at the International Research Institute for Climate and Society. So I want to know, how will you describe your work to people who are not from sciences? Thank you.
Yes, thanks. Thanks so much for the introduction, Haijin, and thanks Radhika for organizing it. Yeah, so to address your question, first of all, it's not a simple answer, but I could answer the question just by giving a quick snapshot of my background. So I am a meteorologist by training, and I definitely consider myself still mostly on the quantitative science side. That's kind of how my brain primarily works. However, I am not a traditional scientist, nor do I intend to be. I'm very interested in and active in integrating the climate and meteorological science and data into decision-making, in particular within humanitarian communities and in decision-making contexts. So the way I like to describe my work is at the intersection of science, policy, and practice. So it is driven by the scientific method, let's say, very broadly speaking, and coming from, just the way that weather systems work and climate science works. But I'm not so interested in the theoretical side of things, let's say, for example, very much interested in and driven by what does it mean to influence and inform decision-making within the humanitarian sector from an operational perspective, but also from a policy perspective. And that is something I'm surprised that I say today, because even when I started working in the humanitarian sector, it was mostly on the operational side. It wasn't so much in the policy, but now more and more, and what I'll be sharing today is also kind of more on the policy side. How do we think about standard operating procedures and more structured approaches to climate-informed, let's say, decision-making?
Okay. Thank you so much for your introduction. We read your article, the humanitarian sector needing clear job profiles for climate science translators more than ever during a pandemic. And to me, the main essence of this article is that climate science translators are very, very important, but our education system is not well prepared for this important role. So my first question would be, who are climate science translators, and what brought you to write about this article using a similar concept?
Yes. So who are climate science translators? Well, I consider myself at least partially a climate science translator. Some of my work is definitely doing that type of activity. But another person is my co-author, Marcus Inenkel, who we both found ourselves a few years ago being let's say, quantitative scientists engaging with the humanitarian sector. And both of us were like, well, we're just surprised that there's not more people. And we thought a lot about like why that is. And one of the reasons why, and I'll share this from my perspective, is, well, if you ask people within the humanitarian and disaster management context, there is interest in talking to scientists and integrating science and in understanding which science is best fit. However, it's not an easy task, you know. I mean, most people in those communities don't go through any sort of training or any coursework. It's an acknowledgement that this sort of data could be useful, but it's like, where do we go? What sources? How do we understand which sources are best? And they're looking for people to engage with that do understand the science. However, many times the best scientists either don't have time to engage with the humanitarian sector, or it's a skill in itself, right? So the incentive structures aren't necessarily there from a career perspective to allocate resources and time as a scientist to stepping outside the traditional space, you know, the traditional space of you need to teach, you need to raise money, you need to publish papers. None of that really includes working and building trust within the humanitarian community. So Marcus and I are people who've done it differently, you know, and definitely prioritized being embedded with humanitarian organizations, myself with the Red Cross, amongst others. And quite frankly, one of the reasons why we wrote the paper is, has it impacted our careers as being a scientist? I think absolutely yes. I think this sort of impact is under-described or misdescribed and under-acknowledged and appreciated. And when it comes down to it, it definitely impacts scientists growing in their career, because the definition of scientist growth is still driven by traditional metrics. So until that changes, I think it is to some degree kind of inappropriate to keep saying, we need people at the interface. We need scientists to engage with the humanitarian community or decision makers. It's really hard to do, and it's actually disincentivized from a structural perspective. So that's one of the reasons why we wrote the paper, is to say, well, okay, if we're saying that things are wrong, well, how do we fix it? You know, what are some of the core competencies from an educational perspective that we need to promote and at least discuss? So that's what this paper outlines. It's definitely not a final representation at all, but it's some ideas that we think should be considered in defining this sort of work as a specific role, a specific career path, and not a compromise. That's another thing that happens sometimes, where I'll go to AGU or other science conferences to present, and to some degree, I'm still considered like, well, not a real scientist, you know, someone who spends too much time with decision makers. And then other times I'll be deployed with the Red Cross, and even there, I'm not considered like a humanitarian worker, right? Because I'm more of a scientist. So it's trying to operate and build a career in this limbo. And yeah, I think there's opportunities to change that. I think places like Columbia with the climate school, thinking about the fourth purpose, I think this is a good example of exactly what that could mean and how we could really incite change in a meaningful set of activities.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. So now we can see like the importance of the climate science translators and also the high need for them. You also mentioned like the core competencies that a climate translator scientist should have. So
Yeah.
could you please talk more about like what kind of core competencies they should have, like the educational background or language skills, like those kind of things?
Yes. So I think, I'll take a step back here, and I see that we have a group that we have, I'll ask everyone a question, and basically just take a few seconds and think about where you stand, your work within that spectrum of like data development through data dissemination, you know, through data use to actually integrating it into doing something, taking action. You know, we talk about this chain. You know, I'm the person designing the algorithms. I'm the person producing maps. I'm the person propagating that, you know, developing an app or developing a web interface. And then on the other end, someone who's interacting with that. All these are steps within the process, from data production all the way down to actually taking action on the ground to help people. So just think to yourself, just for even 10 seconds, where do you stand? And if you're not active in this community, like what are you interested in? What part along that chain? So I'm not gonna, yeah, let's just take five or 10 seconds and think about that. Okay, so I hope everyone has some point in mind or some points where they are interested in or operate. Well, and I think that there are different skills depending on where you are within that chain, you know, and who you're engaging with within that chain. It's oversimplified to say like point A to point B, data to decision maker. I see very few examples of that working in the real world. So I think the first step when we talk about what are the skills is describing what you're trying to do. Are you trying to be the person who designs algorithms to bias correct the raw data from different sensors? You know, I used to do that sort of stuff and I really enjoyed doing that, but I decided to move away from that to some degree, have the knowledge of doing that, but then step towards a place where there is movement, you know, propagation of that, somehow tweaking and tailoring of that data. Am I the person on the ground that basically says, okay, I'm a refugee camp manager and I'm in charge of developing disaster risk management plans. What does it mean to take action before a tropical cyclone? You know, what forecasts am I going to use? What actions will I actually take? How long does it take to actually take those actions? I mean, that person is very important along that chain, but the questions and considerations they have are going to be very different. Also, when we talk, another important point to be aware, and I think all climate science translators should be aware of this and also able to communicate this, is the overarching context of uncertainty, you know, and confidence and accuracy and skill. These are all words that get thrown around, I feel, and they all mean different things to some degree. So I think this is something where if we go back to the principle of just being able to call things what they are and make sure expectations are matched. You know, I've been in situations where forecasts are blamed. You know, this forecast was bad. You know, we don't trust the forecast. Well, I mean, I think many times the tension there is that the forecast wasn't communicated appropriately. You know, the expectation wasn't set that this forecast is designed to be wrong sometimes. So this is something that is maybe somehow difficult to be aware of the importance of that from a data scientist or climate scientist perspective. But within the translator role, you kind of have trust in brokering potential on both sides as a way to communicate not only from the data side down to the decision makers, I shouldn't even say down, data science towards the decision maker, but also what are the considerations? What are the concerns of the decision maker? What is the tolerance to uncertainty, you know, related to the decision-making context, and how do we communicate that back to the decision maker? A climate science translator ideally will be able to go back and forth between these communities.
Okay, thank you so much. So furthermore, do you think is there anything that we can do to fill the gaps in the education field that to address the high need for climate science translators?
Yes, I'm happy you asked. And this is also something that I've learned a lot from Radhika, just learning more about just education and the design of the different approaches. I think that the one thing that I think is on one hand, perhaps a challenge for a scientist to think about, but it's okay you don't have to be the world's best climate scientist to be a very good climate science translator. You know, you don't need to be the world's best humanitarian worker to be engaging or to be a climate science translator. It's about the brokering and the tailoring and understanding the processes within that chain to a certain degree to be able to communicate and broker relationships and trust, but also understand the privilege that comes with that too. Like you're in a very privileged position to be trusted by various communities. And I think that is something that the climate science translator must be aware of. I think that's an opportunity though, because I think within all the elements within that chain, that's something that we could do better at. You know, and I think that does speak to a lack of awareness of the complexity of the different, let's say, nodes along the chain from data development to actually taking actions. but that is something that the climate science translator could help with and should help with. And that's something that I think could come across in well-defined curricula. So yeah, and it's something that I think some of these interdisciplinary climate science programs that are being developed, for example, the Climate and Society Master's Program. I'm biased there because I'm faculty in that program, but it is something that we stress. Like this group, you will not come out of this program necessarily being a climate scientist, very unlikely to have those skills. However, you will be very knowledgeable about climate science. You will have a sense of what questions to ask, and what red flags to be aware of when you're trying to figure out questions about appropriateness of data use, appropriateness of forecasts, and these sorts of things. The last thing I'll say is, and I think this is an interesting thought when we're talking about education component, is being aware of what you don't know and being able to acknowledge the pressure and then also confront the pressure to say, well, you know what, this is perhaps something out of our scope. We need to seek out alternative sources. And this is something I've seen in the humanitarian and development community that, for example, unfortunately, I've seen it various times where you'll see like what top climate advisors and climate strategists make claims and use different data sets that are actually inappropriate and could be potentially damaging. So I think if we had a role like climate science translators, it would be easier, I think, to not only encourage this sense of expectations and awareness and appropriateness, but also a way to monitor and evaluate that, to see what works and what doesn't work.
Okay. Thank you so much for all this very useful sharing. So now I think I'm gonna hand over the microphone to the audience. Does anyone have some questions for Andrew?
I think everyone is probably digesting what Andrew said, because I think those were very pertinent things, Andrew. I just want to ask a question which has been in my mind, and when I read your paper, I think it came back to me in this quest of, evidence. In education, we call it, best practices, and we will collect best practices. This idea of the brokerage and having a relationship and the focus on the process, don't you think we have enough evidence to make that connection and be the science translator, make things possible? Because it's really not possible for the same person to come up with the best practices. We know sometimes the best practices are very common practices, which are commonsensical, and in each community it is different. So when a researcher or a evidence searcher is trying to find out what these best practices are in literature, which may or may not be able to, or conduct experiments, or do other things, we are missing out on a big component that we can learn from the community, give back. And sometimes we lose the trust of the NGO because we are coming with some best practices that have worked in Ethiopia, and we are now saying, okay, India, can you do these best practices, because these are curation of best practices that would help. Long question, but I don't know, what is your sense of when you work on the ground on this idea?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Radhika. I fully agree that this needs to be, let's say, better at first, just contextualized and described first. And that's where I think this paper, we were careful to I mean, I'm not sure, perhaps the words best practice are used in there, but I think we try to avoid those words, because I don't think we're necessarily there yet. I think we're at the stage of just describing what this role could be and thinking about the responsibilities, and then figuring out how to monitor and evaluate what works and doesn't work, which I think will point to eventually some sets of best practices, which could then inform educational goals and priorities, perhaps, is kind of the way that we're thinking. But also we don't know. I think in the spirit of the climate science translators, it's kind of knowing what your limitations are. So I think even in the paper, it's presented more as an opinion piece. However, we do have some data that we included to show that the types of roles are actually increasing. We see they're not called climate science translators, but if we classify different types of humanitarian sector jobs, classify them based on actually what's being asked of people, we could see that over time, that essentially what are the climate science translator roles are increasing. However, we don't call them that yet. You know, the tasks speak to a climate science translator's roles and responsibilities, but the positions are still called like program officer, you know, or climate specialist and these sorts of things, where it's, I mean, that's fine to some degree, but we're saying we could label this. You know, we have enough evidence here to call it something. And maybe climate science translator is not, it won't be the final name either, but it's something to put a label on it, and then we could have a discussion about what that means. So I think, yeah, and I think a lot of that does involve the communities, you know, acknowledging what the community has to offer within the data development process, you know, acknowledging what works and what doesn't work, being able to say, being able to understand our influence and our privilege in being present in the communities. I think that is definitely a part of it. So we have an opportunity to describe this role. I think we must do it in a different way than we have before. I think in some ways the role of a climate scientist has kind of gone astray, and it could be more driven by impact in the communities. However, I understand it's not that easy. You know, I understand that these titles mean something, and there are motivations around describing titles in roles as they are. But again, yes, that's another reason why we wanted to bring this up for debate.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Can I ask a final question for you? It's like we talked about many things before, so can you just like give some like very short and suggestions for people who may want to become climate science translators in their future?
Yes. So I think, so the first statement I'll say is my first reaction. Thank you for the question. My first reaction is, if you have any questions about this, I'm very happy to connect with you. I'll put my email here. So that's the first step. Yes, definitely reach out, and I could try to help. I'm very glad to do that. My second comment is this, as we showed in the paper, and it was important to have some sort of empirical evidence. These types of jobs are increasing. We need more. We don't know the number that we need, but I think in the coming years, we're going to see this type of role being in even higher demand. So now is a great time to think about if this would work for you. And yeah, it's something that is definitely, if you're interested in a climate role that's driven by science and by data, but also has elements of impact in the real world, this is the type of job that we're thinking about. It's different than a program manager job. It's different than a data scientist job. You know, it's something that necessitates knowledge on various sides, but also where you could operate in between and be comfortable with that. So in order to increase the comfort level, you know, for someone to have a career in this, again, that's why we're trying to put guardrails and define this sort of role. So I think like the next steps include universities, you know, and other educational units thinking about what it could mean. Do we need a climate science translator master's degree? Well, I mean, we have similar, so perhaps not. Do we need certificates of these sorts of things? Do we need a society? I'm not sure, you know, but I think these are things that we should start thinking about.
Okay, thank you. I think I'm very interested in learning more about this because I think it's a pretty cool role to do in my future. So today I may like just wrap up now. Thank you so much, Andrew, again for your time and your knowledge. We appreciate that a lot. And also thank you all for your time to join us today. Please kindly follow our Twitter handle for more fireside chats in the future. It's Mission 4.7. I just tap it into the chat.
Oh, thanks.
Follow it. Okay.
So also, I think Radhika has one more observation.
Just one observation, Hayden and Andrew. I think some parallels between what I have seen at the Earth Institute and the Climate School is basically scientists not just focusing on data analysis. I think that was the old model of scientists doing the analysis and publishing a paper. I think what has, as an external observer from Teachers College, Columbia University, when I came into the Earth Institute, I saw scientists really going into the field, learning about the cultures, learning about communities. Jeff is also here, Jeff Shigelmich is here, and he also focuses on community-driven learning. So I really like that aspect where climate scientists are also learning about the cultures, and maybe that is what we need to be doing. It's a learning curve from both ends. I'm sure communities learning about sciences and the scientists learning about the cultures. But more and more with the sustainable development goals, I see that it has to be both parallelly done together to be able to resolve this issue. So I really appreciate what you are trying to do here, especially for the educators who are now looking at these competencies, and we will make sure that we have these competencies integrated into Mission 4.7's guiding principles, and hopefully lots of teachers and other university professors are able to take these guidelines and adopt it and change it and make it their own. But at least this thinking will prevail. So really appreciate your thoughts there.
Well, thank you so much, Radhika. I'm glad that it's you find this useful, and yes, I look forward to future discussion on this. It's something that I think we must face, and unfortunately, we have an opportunity to do this. So yes, thank you all. If there are any other questions, I mean, I have a few more moments. So if you want to ask a question or type it in the chat, I'm curious to hear if anyone has ever thought about something like this before. Or do you like the name or not? I mean, is it any other reactions? I think it's a good time to hear from everybody. However, also, if not, you could feel free to send an email as well.
Some people have joined from Nigeria. I know others are local, but with a very international mindset. So it would be nice if we have any questions from the audience. If not, we will definitely follow up with Andrew and send him a list of questions if you can send it to us. Great. Andrew, I think there will be more questions from our international audience as well, and we will share this video and maybe also share your link to the paper, and if there are any comments, we'll let you know.
Okay, well, thank you all so much for joining, and yeah, thank you Haijen and Radhika as well.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Thanks, Haijen.
Thank you all. Hope to see you all in our next chat.